Brian Mackenzie, what would you say the number one thing, if you had to pick one, that is the biggest encumbrance to people being able to properly downregulate, maybe relieve some stress, consequently improve their performances?
On a physiological level, it is a tolerance to CO2, which has to do with their nervous system. So, an interesting, I was just on a call with a friend of mine who's writing a book on walking, and she wanted to go over some stuff with breathing. And she's like, she's a DPT, so she's doctorate in physical therapy, so she's well educated inside the world of all of this stuff. And she's like, our normal respiration rates that the medical community says are 12 to 18 breaths a minute, is that normal? And I'm like, well, it's normal for the culture that we're in. And I'm like, but my respiration rate's around 7, and I don't do a tremendous amount of breath work. However, I've done enough, and I apply the principles of this stuff into what it is I'm doing. And that just, that is alluding to the fact that most people are so running hot or stressed that their nervous system's pretty, fried, or they've become so CO2 intolerant. So we respond to carbon dioxide. It's a big, if not the biggest player in driver for breathing while we're awake. And it's not the only one, but it's one of the main ones. And when we become sensitive to this, rightfully so, our breathing changes. The dynamics of our breathing change. If our mouth is open, we instantly change our respiration rate. And that's more to do with baroreception, which is not chemoreception, which is where CO2 fits in, meaning pressure change. But a lot of people are talking all day long, which is mouth breathing. So my respiration rate's up. A lot of people are very stressed. They just mouth breathe in general. So they go exercise and they're not doing a whole lot, or they're walking around and their mouth is open. That all can move towards being, you're offloading excessive CO2 at that point. So when you're over breathing, what we're doing is you offload, you get rid of more CO2. You don't bring on more O2. In fact, you and I right now we exhale roughly 80% of the oxygen that's coming in. So we don't need it, right? We don't need all that oxygen because there's plenty. It's just only when exercise or movement goes up that changes. So what happens is we change the dissociative curve of what's going on with our breathing. And when we become a little less, we're not using oxygen as well, and we still continue to get stressed, our breathing goes up. And so we just kind of, the system self-adjusts and tries to balance itself out in what it does. And part of that process is that our breathing changes. The dynamics of our breathing change. And it just gets easier to breathe like that versus taking, and you don't need to be taking a full inhale while we're sitting here. You're breathing perfectly fine as we're sitting here, but the vast majority of people are not.
While I'm at it, one of the things that I do like about Thrive Market, which I talk about all the time on my channel, and I know you're thinking, oh, here comes the plug. You're right, is that Thrive Market doesn't have a bunch of stuff that has weird added ingredients into it. Like, they adopt a lot of what sort of the EU puts into place for their processed foods. So like packaged foods at Thrive Market don't have weird additives, there's no red dyes and crazy stuff. So at least, even if some of the stuff is processed, like maybe some pantry staples and stuff like that, it's the way that it should be. Processed because you're processing it, not because you're adulterating it and turning it into some hyper palatable nonsense. So that link that I put down below is for a 30% off discount link for anything from Thrive Market. So when you go ahead and you use Thrive Market, you get 30% off your entire grocery order when you use that link that's down below. They also have frozen meat and seafood options. They're starting to roll out fresh options for some people. You might not see it reflected on your account or not. But the bottom line is they've got really good stuff. And they've got canned fish, so they've got the tuna, they've got Wild Planet sardines and anchovy. I mean, all that stuff if you're into that and you're trying to live more Mediterranean. But some of the things that I love the most are just being able to get healthier snack options for my kids, because I don't want to just go to regular Vons or Safeway here in California and get something that has a load of garbage and MSG and stuff in it. If I'm going to get them a snack, I want something that I feel like, I don't know, I don't feel bad about giving them. So that's the whole idea behind Thrive Market, is being able to bring healthier options to the consumer at a decent price, right? So that link down below gets you 30% off plus a free gift. I really do recommend that you check them out. Like, check them out. They've been a sponsor on this channel for over half a decade, and I wouldn't be recommending them if it wasn't something that I honestly used myself. So that link is in the top line of the description.
And so that overbreathing thing, the 12 to 18 breaths a minute, a lot of that's done on data that's being collected from something called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which isn't exactly the most effective way, or the algorithms off of a lot of the technologies that are on the periphery, which is not very accurate in terms of understanding a respiration rate. So meaning, like, if you're wearing an Aura or a Whoop, your respiration rate is probably not what that is telling you. There's a good chance it's not. That said, the data with those things is also, but that not also, the data with those sort of things are consistent. Meaning, if there's a change with inside that. So they're, they might be inaccurate. They're just consistently inaccurate, which is a good thing. Yeah. And they're different. But if you would want to, if you really wanted to understand respiration rate, since I talked about it, since I brought this up, it's you would get that. You would get something, a strap or something that would actually measure, like, as your rib cage begins to move, the depth of that, or you get on a resting metabolic, you do a resting metabolic test assessment, and that'll actually capture your breathing rate and what's going on. And that's not the be all end all here. What is that, well, with people who have dysfunctional breathing, and that is, by the way, dysfunctional breathing, and anything, in my opinion, anything above 15 breaths a minute is dysfunctional. You have a massive gap in how your physiology is going to operate, and we can make major changes very quickly. And that would be through things like going for a walk and shutting your mouth, or doing a little breath work and slowing down your breathing to a degree, or doing some breath hold work that actually helped us increase the CO2 in the system, so that we actually were using the oxygen a bit more. And it's not just about the oxygen. Oxygen's a worthless, destructive molecule without carbon dioxide inside of this system. In fact, it's largely a destructive. Oxygen is very destructive itself, and far more destructive than CO2. It's just how that CO2 is getting used, right? And if I don't have enough of it in the system, the vasculature constricts more, right? So if I have more of it in the system, the vasculature opens up, we vasodilate. So we start to train the system as a whole when we actually bring on an adequate amount of that. So I think, to answer your question, CO2 tolerance becomes a very big player in some of the lowest hanging fruit that people could actually go and understand. And that is simply by just slowing down your breathing a few times a day, maybe doing some breathing protocols that you like, maybe not doing some hyperventilation stuff if you've got any issues going on, just until you've addressed this stuff. And then applying this into your current, movement strategy, like go for a walk, 20, 30, 45 minutes and shut your mouth and see how you feel after that. And there will be a very big difference if it's the first time you've really done something like that.
What's happening in the brain when CO2 builds?
That's a good question. So, a good friend of mine, his name's Dr. Justin Feinstein, did some work around studying the amygdala. He originally was doing research around like float tank therapy, stuff like that. and people get down regulating, but he got curious about this breathing thing. And he ended up studying 2 sets of twins that had calcified amygdalas, and he was studying people that had anxiety. High levels, medical level, like medically treated people with anxiety, okay? If you have a calcified amygdala, you're pretty much, you are a danger to yourself. You don't interpret fear as well, right? So you'll put your hand like on a stove and not think about that, right? Like it's just not something that kind of equates, you know? You just become a little bit of a danger to yourself, right? And he was exposing people with anxiety to bolus hits of carbon dioxide. And he inevitably ended up exposing these 2 sets of twins to CO2 as well. And the twins had some of the most profound fear that they had ever experienced ever in their lives when exposed to the CO2. And it turns out the amygdala, even though it's part of the limbic system and has this kind of like fear center in it, it also is a modulator of CO2, carbon dioxide. And when my nervous system, when I'm hot, like if I'm upset or I'm been doing way too much, I worked out a ton, and I need to recover, I've done multiple days and I've been training, your nervous system gets a bit fried. You will notice that you are more reactive. All of that plays into how CO2 is actually operating as well. My nervous system can be running hot, and you can bet your tolerance to CO2 has gone down, meaning you are much more sensitive to that. So the chemoreceptors and everything that's going on in that brain is now more sensitive to this stuff. However, if I can bring it down enough and I can expose myself to an adequate amount of CO2, let's go back in time. When people used to have panic attacks, what would they do, let's just say in the 70s and 80s, if somebody was having a panic attack?
Stop and breathe.
They'd hand them a paper bag and tell them to breathe into the paper bag.
That's true.
Why would they have somebody do that? CO2. Yeah. Turns out that you can slow things down and calm down a bit more when you add a bit more CO2 into the system. This isn't necessarily like, hey, go out and buy CO2 tanks and start, huffing CO2.
Yeah.
This is like, hey, what's going on here? What could I toggle or introduce into what I'm doing in order to learn more about why I'm a little sensitive to this? It's interesting. We've at Andy Galpin's old lab, one of his students, Preston, did his thesis on a lot of this, on some of this stuff, where we were doing an exhale assess. We do this exhale test where it's a max exhale. You inhale, and then you exhale as long and slow. The redundancy of that is as possible, right? And he found out that I've been using this assessment for years now, and I figured this out, but we wanted somebody else to kind of play with this as well. And he found out that the athletes he was testing, those who had a low CO2 tolerance score, so a low exhale assessment, had more anxiety, and that was very much indicative of that. Their state anxiety was predictable by this test. So I can basically, and that doesn't mean I'm diagnosing you with anxiety, by the way. That just means from a nervous system standpoint, anxiety sits on the nervous system. Like anxiousness is a point where you're beyond, like it's a nervous system response. So it's not every day you're going to be dealing with this, but you can bet that if you learn to stop overshooting the mark and getting anxious or taking on or worrying too much, when you're in those moments, you're going to find out if you do an exhale or you try and hold your breath, or test this, it's going to be real low. Yeah. When you get a hold of that and you can remain calm, it's going to go up. Mm-hmm. But this is a very trainable thing to a degree that, the vast majority of people, as a, just kind of a blanket statement here, like the vast majority of people, if I had them hold their breath, aren't going to hold their breath much longer than 90 seconds, right? CO2 tolerance plays a very big role in your ability to hold your breath, right? Part of that is your ability to deal with the pain and the panic that's starting to shoot up and go off. But a large majority of that is an adaptive process to this and being able to tolerate more CO2 in the system and getting used to that. So the vast majority of people hold their breath for 90 seconds, yet there are human beings holding their breath for 7 minutes, no problem. So that's a large gap, right? And I'm not suggestive that anybody go out and learn to hold their breath for 7 minutes, but could be a cool, fun time to go do that. But at any rate, you get that breath hold up to 2, 3, maybe 4 minutes. You can bet you're going to be a calmer, less reactive person. 100%.
What's the benefit to doing a hold on full versus a hold on empty?
The hold on, a number of things. Within like the yogic world, they've long started with things on an exhale hold. I've found that the inhale hold is a lot easier to work with people, just because it allows for you to an off switch, like let go. So if I'm holding up top, it's right to let go versus right. The inhale is typically the problem for people in a lot of my work. So meaning people inhale rather quickly versus the ability to inhale slowly, right? And then there are those of us that, will struggle a bit with an exhale, but that's largely a CO2 tolerance thing. So the inhale hold is more of a pressure thing. You're going to see blood pressure. You're going to see pressure changes as a result of that. People who struggle with bringing their parasympathetic nervous system on board. So high stress people they might have some issues with the inhale breath hold, meaning they'll get woozy real quick. There'll be a disconnect from the heart to the brain as a result of that because of the pressure changes. But I don't work to do like maximal, like stuff the lung type of stuff. And, a lot of this stuff with inhale breath holds, what I have people do is simply to first and like strong urge to breathe, not panic urge to breathe. Those seem to have the biggest impacts with people. So just repeating like an on the minute, like, hey, I'm going to breathe for a minute or two, and then I'm going to hold my breath until a strong urge to breathe. And doing that for 5 or 6 sets is a very, very big down-regulating tool. Now, if somebody's tuned up that's pretty anxious, that may not be the thing to do. It may be go the other way. To the negative is you're working with dead space mostly. Now, there's still some air in there in the lungs on an exhale, but you got to be pretty damn tuned in, like a Mark Healy or like a, yogi from India to get all that air out of your lungs. Yeah. Other than that, let's just say and I hold, there's not as much of a blood pressure change that's occurring. There's more of we're kind of working on the immediacy of CO2's response to the system. So you're going to actually work more on the psyche with a negative breath hold, in my opinion, because people if people just right now were to go ahead and dump all the air you've got and hold your breath, see how quickly panic comes on. Now relax after you heard that and did that. Take a few breaths and then go do it with an inhale. You're not going to panic as quick. Yeah. It's just not going to happen. So I kind of look at it in terms of, working more on the mental with the negative and working more on the physiological with the positive. However, there are definitely, there's some differences, but there's also much crossover. You hold your breath enough on either end with very few breaths, you're going to get hypoxic. introduce hypoxia, but most people will never reach that point because they're so CO2, I wouldn't say so, but they're CO2 intolerant enough to where CO2 is convincing them to take a breath well before oxygen is going lights out.
Is there a metabolic interplay here as well, like the mitochondria's ability to kind of function in this hypoxic state?
Yes. Yeah. The beauty of this, and there's a great paper out there. I forget what I'm paraphrasing, but I think it's called The Tortoise and the Hare. Mm-hmm. There's an actual paper where these guys in Sweden, I believe it was Sweden, they studied two of the people who were at the university were at the time, one was an elite triathlete and one was an elite freediver. And they were both competing that year, and they wanted to test, well, what's the difference between mitochondria and the aerobic function of these? And one would have suspected and been correct that the triathlete who's at an elite level has far greater we would assume metabolic health and the ability to function aerobically at higher states. Correct. There's the one major caveat here, and this is where hypoxia becomes a very, very potent tool. And there's much more to hypoxia that we could go into a rabbit hole on. However, the breath holding and learning to hold one's breath and get to hypoxia, in particular, they found that the free diver is able to use less oxygen with more ATP. So they are far more efficient on that end of energy, getting energy off of that electron transport chain than the aerobically inclined athlete. Now, I wouldn't suggest that you do one or the other. I would suggest you do both, as I do.
What about concurrently? I mean, what about literally, this might be a more advanced, so I mean, disclosure there, but someone that is, maybe doing zone 2, maybe they're doing their base training. Is there some form of benefit to doing occasional holds while actually training?
Yes.
Okay.
I have people do this all. Yeah, this is part of training regimen, like 101 with me. It's just like, yeah, hey, we're going to be doing this. You're also doing this. Like we're targeting these things in many aspects. Like most
so
of my
holding your breath while you're running.
Most of my clients don't just do strength and conditioning and endurance work. They do strength conditioning, endurance work, breath hold work, etc. They're getting the whole. But it's a lot. If I were to start dumping out everything we do, it's, heat training, cold training, like all of it. Where's the time for? Well, that's the thing. Is the art is in. Hey, what's this person's schedule look like? Where can we insert these things so that they're actually effective? Because if they're not, if we can't, there's no sense. Why would we implement this?
Yeah.
Breath hold is just a very simple thing to implement for anybody.
If you were to say, I mean, this is a hypothetical situation where you're going to, hop on an assault bike, let's say do, a 20 calorie hit on an assault bike and then hop off. Is there a benefit at an advanced level to attempting a hold during your recovery there?
Oh, yeah. No, there's research to support. Well, I would go about it in a way of go do a sprint, short sprint, right? Warmed up, going into some sprints. Here's what I like to do is 5 minutes, every 5 minutes, you're hitting anywhere from 6 to 15 seconds, right? Okay. Hard. And you could definitely go out to 90 seconds or 3 minutes if you want for intervals. By all means, hold your breath on the last 6 seconds. Just hold it. Just lock it down. You'll be able to get through it. Hold it, and you'll start to see you can end up holding it a little bit longer and a little bit longer. Yeah. That has very big impacts with stuff like this. You're not going to really get hypoxic from stuff like that. Like what I was bringing up with the tortoise and the hare. What you're going to do is you're going to start getting probably some boosts in EPO and some red blood cell responses short term, and then long term you're going to get some of that stuff that'll hold on. It's not going to be something I think that I would use for going to altitude, but it will help for sure. For 100%, it will help. It's not going to be the thing that you would want to be doing for altitude exposure, though.
If we pivot for a second to talk, nasal versus mouth.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I've personally, I'll just use my own experience here, is My ability to inhale through the nose through activity is fine. It's exhalation through the nose that becomes almost restricted. It's just harder. It's just like it takes more time. And by the time all the air is out of my nose, I'm hypoxic. It's like I'm, it's taking so long for the air to physically come out of my nose that then I'm almost going into oxygen debt, right? So, or what feels like it. So then it's like, then you're...
Yeah, it's just CO2.
Yeah.
That's the carbon dioxide screaming at you.
Yeah. So it's, I'm sure there's different modalities, but if you're working on quote unquote nasal breathing, is it okay to exhale through the mouth during activity? So inhale nose, exhale mouth, or is that a completely different response than if you also exhale through the nose?
Well, so nose breathing we know is parasympathetic, has more parasympathetic tone. It's that exhale that's the most important part of that.
Okay.
Here's why. Anything below moderate levels of exercise, I'm getting the same amount of oxygen.
Okay.
I do not need to switch over until beyond moderate levels of exercise to onboard more oxygen. Okay? It's the CO2 coming out that is really the player in this game, to where versus I just dumped all that CO2. So now we start to mess with that dissociative curve that I was kind of talking about, right? And not in all cases, but in most cases, like if you have to mouth breathe at less than moderate levels of exercise, you can bet you're messing with aerobic stuff.
Yeah.
Maybe not a ton, but enough. Yeah. And if that's your goal, then and that would be my goal if I was somebody who was exercising. I'd use high intensity for high intensity, and we get into mouth breathing plenty. I see many, many people who are glued to the concept of nose breathing till the end. Like it's just, they nose breathe even at high intensity. And you are doing the exact same thing, but in an opposite way of over breathing now.
Yeah.
You are literally not able to use oxygen the way it was used, and your system's getting more acidic than it actually needs to. So, pH is changing, hydrogen's not getting dealt with as well. All this stuff is, I've seen the crossovers on the metabolic stuff, where people are limiting themselves and they lack the ability to sustain higher respiration rates at higher intensities.
Do you, with your training in that case, do you have a pretty clear line of delineation between, hey, here's my aerobic stuff and here's my high intensity stuff? Like not sitting in that kind of, that there's some people out there that'll believe that if you train within that gray area, sort of, almost kind of lactate threshold area, that's like really a sweet spot where you're just, and then there's others that are saying like, hey, no, we have like it's a very clear line of delineation where we don't sit in that gray area. We either go extreme high intensity or we go lower intensity, and the magic ends up naturally happening by training those two systems. I'm just curious your take on that.
No, I don't think any man-made thought on how my body should respond to things should be limited. That doesn't mean, and I'm very, very, very careful to watch what it is I in particular inevitably get enamored with. I've been enamored with low intensity. I've been enamored with high intensity.
Yeah.
and I've done moderate intensity. I've been enamored with that as well. It all plays a critical role. I don't consider like walking low intensity.
No.
I consider that the buy-in for you and anybody to manage any and all activity. Yeah. That doesn't mean like I've got, like I wouldn't ask an NFLer to be walking 90 minutes a day because they're probably at practice and they're probably getting 10,000 steps in a day anyway. So I just want them to do like 15, 20 minutes in the morning or something just to clear, get lactate levels down, get cortisol levels down in the morning so that we're kind of stabilized and ready to go. But yeah. I think the full spectrum. However, I'm very careful to I would say, look, 80% of what you're doing, if your mouth should be shut, but you would be best being mouth open several times a week for very short periods of time. Yeah.
And I think being able to, how do you suggest that someone that maybe isn't as in tune with their body, be able to regulate and understand like when they need to throttle down their training versus throttle it up? Because I have found that is a very confusing place for most people, and it's on both ends of the spectrum, whether it's an extreme or an elite athlete versus someone that's a newbie. It's very difficult to really ascertain, like, okay, when is it time to throttle down? When am I doing, like, when your sort of allosteric load is so high already, like, do you throttle down your training or do you try to increase your training to deal with it? Like, how does someone kind of regulate that? What would you suggest to someone?
I mean, it's a great question. I think people really need to spend time learning what adaptation looks like with one thing at a time. Mm-hmm. So, like I brought up the walking thing before with you, right? Like I get people to walk. Well, I want you just to implement that right now. And then, whatever else you're doing, just keep doing that. But we're walking. You're going to find out if you can do the other stuff if you've added in 45 minutes to 90 minutes of walking a day, right? Like you will find out if you can continue to have that stuff. Then it's like, okay, well, what's the goal? I was talking to a buddy of mine who's down in Australia last week, and I hadn't seen him in a number of months. And we do video chat, and it came on, and I was like, whoa, somebody put on some weight. And not fat. He definitely put on muscle. Like I was like, damn. And he's like, yeah. He goes, it's interesting. I'm only lifting 3 days a week. And he goes, he's 35. And he's like, what's interesting is that I'm lifting far less than I did when I was in my 20s. And I'm putting on more muscle now than I was then. I'm like, isn't that interesting? Like how many of us think we just need to go do more, and literally are missing adaptive processes because we're just continuing to add in a stressor, be it weightlifting, right? As the example, like I know a lot of people who train 6 days a week, right? And continue to do it. And there's a sharp ramp up at first with that. And then it just peters out and it does its thing, and that's real hard to make gains. Mm-hmm. Versus like, hey, how about 3 days a week of that? What happens with that? Are people willing to toggle or screw around with things to learn where that is? What can you get away with? What is still creating the gains that you want? What do you want? Yeah. All right, well, let's put one thing down first. Let's go after that thing, and let's screw around to find out where that sweet spot is with this. And the reality is that's what life's about. Being able to creatively figure out what works and what doesn't, so that you're doing the things you want versus not doing the things you're not. Yeah. You don't want to be doing. I'm continuing to work out all the time and do all this stuff that because I'm doing everything. I'm doing the ice bath. I'm doing the sauna. I'm doing the hyperbaric chamber. I'm doing the hypoxico. I'm doing the strength and conditioning. I'm like, dude, like I get it because I do all that stuff. However, it all comes in little segments. Like it's not all going on at the same time. No. There's, it's all adjusted because I've been at it for like 25 years and I know when, you can't do it all at the same time.
And it's kind of funny, like when you if I ask someone, okay, well, why do you want to get in shape? Well, I want to have a six pack. Well, why do you want to have a six pack? Well, because I think it looks cool. Well, why do you think it looks cool? I don't know, because I think my wife will like me more. Why do you think your wife will like you more? Good question. Yeah, maybe I'm afraid she's sleeping with the neighbor. Why do you think she's sleeping with the neighbor? Because I'm a... right? Yeah. It's like you just, maybe that's not an exact situation, but it's like when you start asking, okay, why are you actually doing this? Why are you actually doing this? And it's asking those 5 or 6 layers of why someone's doing something to really understand, like, okay, well, here's, like you're mentioning, this is your driving force behind why you want to do something. So let's just hone in on that. So when you get down to it, it sounds like you actually just need to pressure release and you want to just feel healthy and feel good in your own skin. You don't necessarily want the 6-pack per se. And maybe we need to kind of investigate that a little bit more so that you're not going to the gym, destroying yourself, volume to get shredded, because that's might happen with that quick ramp up that you talk about, but then you're going to destroy yourself pretty damn quick. And then you're going to be right back to square one trying to learn about, okay, well, now I want to get mobile because I've spent the last
I mean, there are, when I hear that, and it's happening everywhere, I just think about the amount of men and women with eating disorders, like, that are just trying to look a specific way.
Yep.
And I say men because there are a lot of men who literally have eating disorders, and because they want to look a specific way because they don't like who they are.
Yep.
And they're not addressing the fundamental layer of why they don't like who they are. And because of the decisions they continue to make, or that, they're insulating themselves around that whole vanity thing, right? Like, if I just look the part, or if I look like I fit in, I won't have to be me.
Yeah.
Like, why wouldn't you want to be you? Like, that's all you should be. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the guys that need to put on certain amounts of muscle or need to look a certain way, and I was certainly that way before, right? Because it almost makes it as though you don't have to, you can talk the talk without actually walking the walk. And when you ask yourself, like, well, did it actually take walking the walk to be able to talk this talk, or could I talk this talk without walking the walk? In other words, I think that a lot of people focus on the body composition piece because they're not really willing to look inside and see, like, why they actually want to focus on the body composition piece.
Yeah, and I mean, you're not saying, and I'm going to be perfectly clear, what I am not saying is that you can't have that. You can have that. You can have the abs, you can have the muscle, you can have all that. However, let that be the byproduct of how you feel about yourself and what you're willing to commit to.
Yep.
Right? And then watch how that, like, I had a guy who literally was like, these workouts, you keep sending me these workouts that, like, they're so confusing, but it's like, I'm not used to this. I'm just used to this, like, bodybuilding type, like, sets and reps and da-da-da-da. And I like to mix things up a lot. And, and I'm like, all right, I understand it can be a little confusing, and look, we just want to stick at this. We keep up with the walking, da da da, and like 2 months later, he's like, what's funny? Because I was about all that, and yet I get more compliments now about what I look like, and I cared more about what I looked like when I was doing the other that I was trying to look a specific way, and now I actually look better. And I'm getting compliments from people that I wasn't expecting I was going to get. I'm like, see how that works?
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's wild. I mean, you look at one way of, for me, having to take a stop, reverse engineer a little bit, and reorient my focus a little bit more. I think at the end of the day, all I ever wanted was the performance side of things and my body to perform the way I wanted it to perform with no arbitrary number. The way I wanted it to perform at that point in time, whether it was to go climb a mountain or to go for I'm like, okay, deep down, it's always about performing. And the physical aspect was a way of me being able to look in the mirror, see a certain look, and tell myself that I'm performing, even if I'm not performing because I have the physique of someone that's performing. When in reality, that was all just like an image, right? Mm-hmm. And then when focusing on performance, when I say performance, relative, not like some, again, specific number, focusing on performance, suddenly all of that falls in line effortlessly without the extra 90% of my energy focused on body composition, just by focusing on the sole thing that I'm actually after when it comes down to my training. And also being able to have the energy to give to my wife and give to my family and give to the things that I truly love and enjoy, which actually made training more about empowering and getting stronger and enjoying it versus constant punishment. And it's amazing, especially when you talk about like the eating disorders with guys, how much of them view their training subconsciously as a punishment versus something that they get to do and something that this amazing body gets to be able to do. And when you empower it like that and you treat it as such, it's amazing how much it changes. Like,
oh yeah.
It's
you nailed it on the head with that. I mean, that's it. It's people are not taking the time to look at why they're doing what they're doing and understanding that if it's for these, attachment issues they're not willing to look at and these material things, it's going to come apart. Yeah. It will come apart. It might not be for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but it's gonna. Yeah. And it ain't going to be pretty the longer it goes. And then it's going to be so hard to unspool that it's it's going to be this more of a devastating process. So it gets harder and harder as it goes. It's still possible, and I see it, and it's actually quite inspiring to see that. But I think people are looking far too much to be motivated into something, instead of just committed to the process. And Bruce Lee is a very famous quote that all goals are an illusion apart from the means is apart from the means, right? Yeah. And the means is the process. If what you're doing ain't about the process, you're fooling yourself.
Yeah,
we're all lying to ourselves with this whole thing with meaninglessness. Like I don't kid myself right now with what it is I do. It's quite literally meaningless.
Yeah,
I exist in a world where we're just all running around doing some bunch of meaningless crap.
Hedonic treadmill.
Yeah. To exist in but that doesn't mean stop doing it. It means, why am I doing this thing? Am I passionate about it? Do I care about it? Great.
Yeah.
Then that gives me ultimate power of being able to do something very, very creative and powerful with it. And at the end of the day, it's not going to matter. Like, what will matter is who I am and what I care about. And I think the people that you surround yourself with will be a reflection of that. And then it's like, coming back to this whole, like, hey, what's the lowest, what are the things that we can look at? Like, what is it like about CO2 tolerance? Why would I bring that up? And it's like, well, this is just a gateway into understanding where all this, where you're at, right? Like a door opening in order to bring it down a beat, to toggle that lever down and go, oh, there's an opportunity here. Not, oh my God, this sucks. Like, no. The process of understanding is lifelong. It will never end. It will not.
And the thing with CO2 is it's never, ever, ever going to lie to you.
No.
Because weights can even be, I used to say like 50 pounds is always going to be 50 pounds. That's the nice thing, is like the weights will never lie to you, except there's so many ways to override your system to get through a workout or to push weight that, although it is pretty solid at giving you feedback, it's not as solid as breath. It's not as solid as the need to breathe, because that is as fundamental and base level as it possibly gets, because without that, you will die.
Yeah. Well, you're gonna breathe. I mean, the reality is you have to breathe. And that's one of the very few things you have to do. And you can try and stop yourself from doing that. It's all right. There's mechanisms in place that'll take you out, that'll shut you down. And the first thing that'll happen when you go unconscious is you'll start to breathe. Yep. And until this life's over, and then you'll pass on and, whatever. If you're not having fun while you're doing this, if you're not into these kind of the core of why you're training and the process of that, like it's just going to be this hamster wheel of just psychoticness living inside of you.
It's you've heard of the gap theory of happiness?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know how much like Seneca you've read or any
a little bit
Stoic stuff, but it's kind of like the gap theory of happiness. And like, I think about this a lot when it comes to training. The gap theory of happiness, essentially, like we're always living in that gap between like the next thing that's going to make us happy. So we live the gap theory, we live in that gap, right? And it's just like, then you achieve that and then it's just another gap to the next thing. And that's hence the hedonic cycle, right? Mm-hmm. With Stoicism, some of what like Seneca has written, talking about basically like such immense gratitude for the moment that you're in by sometimes even focusing on a worst case scenario or a negative to close that gap. Because the trick for them and something that I've been practicing is how do you make that gap between you and what you want? That gap should now become between you and what you already have. So how do you learn to want what you already have so that you're not wanting something you don't have, thereby forcing you into the present to be extremely grateful, have a lot of gratitude for your training, and I am by no means any enlightened person that's an expert, but I will tell you that where my mindset has shifted since applying those kinds of principles is like every time I walk into the gym, I'm grateful that I get to do what I'm doing, and I'm grateful that I get to move my body, and I'm grateful that like I treat my body with respect to be able to do these things. So then I'm not sitting there looking in the mirror being like, I wish I had more veins in my abs. Then I get those veins in the abs. Well, now I want to see the capillaries. Where do you stop? And then eventually you self-destruct, right? So it's just being grateful for, and it just allows you to come into that present by sometimes focusing on shrinking that gap.
I didn't know you could see capillaries. I don't. I love that. How I take that concept is I try and get super present when I'm not comfortable and I'm uncomfortable. Like sitting in traffic, it's not a comfortable thing. Right? By design, traffic is like you're like trying to figure out the equation of why this is right now. Like, why am I just sitting here? Why isn't this moving? Where's the accident? Like all this stuff. And so it's like, can I just be okay with being right here, right now? Yeah. Because it's only a thought. It's only my thoughts right now that are the problem. There's nothing I can do. I could be perfectly content if something else were to occur or the traffic let up. All of a sudden I'm okay, but I'm still in the same place at that moment.
Yep.
Right? Like, oh, wait, what? And that's because I want to be somewhere at a certain time, but I'm not well, there's nothing you can do to change that. No. There is if there is something you can do to change that, do it. But if you can't, which sitting in traffic's the perfect metaphor for this, is it's like there ain't much you can do.
No.
So if I'm just getting more frustrated, that's the monkey getting crazy, man. Yep. Don't let the monkey get crazy.
We have a mutual friend, Dr. Scott Schur.
Yeah.
Have you talked to him at all about the thalamic gate? Are you familiar with the thalamic gate?
No.
So the thalamus, this is something that I've now deployed multiple times in stressful situations. So essentially, we're feeling all emotions.
Yeah.
At the exact same time anyway. It's just which one is bubbling to your consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. The thalamus is essentially a filter, right? Mm-hmm. So it acts as a filter to determine what's the most important and what's most relevant to come to consciousness for survival. So like in a situation like traffic, thalamus is going to filter to say, okay, anxiety needs to appear. But in reality, we're also experiencing happiness, fear, sadness. We're experiencing it all. We just have one bubbling to the consciousness. So it's literally there.
Yeah.
It's literally there. Yeah. And this is not like woo-woo stuff. This is real neuroscience. Yeah. It's literally there. Yeah. So it's the fact that when you realize that, you're like, I'm anxious. but I'm actually also happy, and I'm also
Yeah.
and I'm also all of these. So okay, cool. You're just bubbled up.
I love that. And that's exactly what I was getting at, is it's like the practical application of that is, all right, I'm sitting in traffic, but here's the reality. Like, there was a point in my life where I couldn't afford the car that I'm in right now. And I'm like in this, awesome truck or whatever I'm driving, you're driving. I pay my bills. I get to be here in traffic in this place to go do this thing that, like, I couldn't imagine I'd be sitting where I'm sitting right now. Yeah. That just changed everything in a split second, versus like, why that guy just cut me off? Why is that guy moving like that? Why isn't that guy moving faster? Oh, there it is. It's where we're putting that attention, right? What we give attention to. I did a pretty good job of giving attention to things that weren't actually, providing me with the world that I thought I wanted.
Yeah.
And now I'm doing that pretty damn well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amen, man.
Yeah, well, amen.
Where can everyone find you?
shiftadapt.com. And so there, and then our social media handles. I've got some social media handles, but I'm not very active. So
good.
Yeah.
That's the way to be. Yeah. Right on, brother. Thanks, Sarah.